The heart is a muscular organ consisting of 4 chambers. The walls of these chambers are composed of 3 layers. The thin outer layer is the epicardium. The inner layer, also thin, is the endocardium and is in direct contact with the blood. Between these two lies the main mass of the wall, the muscular contractile myocardium. The primordia of all 3 layers first appear early in the 3rd week after fertilization. The cardiogenic area is in the anterior part of the embryonic disc. The splantopleuric mesoderm in this area will give rise to the epimyocardial mantle, which differentiates later on into epicardium and myocardium.
During the 3rd week of development, the heart is formed from cells that form a horseshoe-shaped region called the cardiogenic region. By day 19, 2 endocardial tubes form. These 2 tubes will fuse to form a single primitive heart tube. As the embryo undergoes lateral folding, the 2 tubes have fused to form a single heart tube. The heart tube grows and develops bulges that are named the bulbus cordis, which forms most of the right ventricle and the outflow tracts for the aorta and pulmonary trunk, the primitive ventricle, which forms most of the left ventricle, the primitive atrium, which forms the anterior parts of the left and right atria, and the sinus venosus, which consists of a left horn and a right horn, and they form the superior vena cava and part of the right atrium.
Being fixed at both ends, the cardiac tube grows rapidly in length, and the embryonic ventricle is bent into a loop to the right of the midline. As development continues, the ventricular region swings back to the midline and expands and grows in length to cover the atrium and great veins.
As the 2 halves of the epimyocardial mantle surrounded the endocardial tube, they fused ventrally, but remained nearly contiguous dorsally as a dorsal mesocardium. As development proceeds, the mesocardium becomes fenestrated, and by the end of the week has almost entirely disappeared, leaving a dorsal passage behind the heart, which will be known later as the transverse sinus of the pericardium. By the 22nd day, the epimyocardium nearly fills the pericardial cavity. The bulboventricular loop is deepening to form the left bulboventricular sulcus. The first aortic arches are declining, and the second are fully developed. By the middle of the 4th week, the 3rd aortic arches are well developed. The myoendocardial space is filled with a homogeneous, transparent jelly which acts as a cushion, across which contractions of the myocardium compress the endocardial lumen. The heart tube is now filled with plasma and blood cells, and the myogenic contractions have become sufficiently strong, rhythmic, and peristaltic to circulate the blood through the chorionic villi, the yolk sac, and all the tissues of the embryo. The 4th aortic arches are fully developed by the middle of the week. The 6th or pulmonary arches have appeared. The capacity of the ventricular sacs is increasing steadily. Since the myocardial pulsations spread in waves from the sinus region toward the aortic sac, the 2 ventricles do not contract simultaneously. 2 distinct currents are thus created, which may be the beginning of the separation between pulmonary and aortic circulation. By the beginning of the 6th week, separation of the truncus arteriosus into aortic and pulmonary channels has begun. The atria are still expanding transversely and are being grooved by the truncus. Ventral extensions are appearing, which will become the auricular appendages. By the end of the week, the 3rd aortic arches have become the common carotids, and the left 4th arch is the definitive aorta. During the 7th week, the aortic and pulmonary trunks become completely separated. During the 8th week, the heart achieves an external form quite similar to that at birth. In the 6 weeks of development just shown, The heart has grown in length from about half a millimeter to about 5 millimeters.
A deep groove separates the atrium from the ventricle. Within the heart, the atrioventricular groove appears as a deep invagination, which constricts the atrioventricular canal at its waist. Cushions extend from opposite sides of the atrioventricular aperture and ultimately fuse into a column dividing the channel between the atrium and ventricle.
This eventual transformation of one opening into 4 can best be seen in a combined sagittal and coronal section. As the atrium grows, its wall absorbs the proximal part of the vessel. When the first branching is reached, 2 openings result, and later on, these 2 are again divided. The sinus venosus is now well formed and begins to migrate toward the right. The second aortic arches develop and then decline, and by the middle of the week, the third arches are carrying a large portion of the burden. It is at this point that the heart has begun to beat with sufficient force to produce a regular flow of blood. Near the end of the week, the 4th pair of aortic arches appears. The atrial region is undergoing extensive transverse enlargement and is bulging into right and left pouches. The sinus venosus is being freed from the septum transversum and now has a single opening into the atria. By the end of the 6th week, only superior and inferior veni cavae and the left duct of Cuvier open into the sinus venosus. The 2 branches of the pulmonary vein have been taken up by the wall of the expanding left atrium and now have separate orifices into it. The 3rd aortic arches are now the common carotids, and the left 4th arch is the definitive aortic arch. New tributaries to the left duct of Cuvier appear, but the vessel itself is receiving less and less blood from the cardinal veins and does not progress much further. By the end of the 8th week, it has lost all connection with the veins of the body and remains as the coronary sinus, draining the veins of the cardiac wall. By the 11th week, the sinus venosus is completely absorbed into the wall of the right atrium. Inferior and superior veni cavae and coronary sinus now have separate openings. By the 14th week, the lower edge of septum secundum overlaps the upper edge of septum primum, which is now acting as the valve of the foramen ovale. In the left atrium, there are 4 pulmonary venous openings. All of the internal structures of the atria are now completed.
A pair of ridges, which develop at the bifurcation, spiral down the truncus arteriosus. They fuse along the axis of the cylinder to produce a single spiral septum, extending down towards the ventricles. The interventricular foramen is obliterated by masses of endocardial tissue from the ventricular septum, by the endocardial cushions, and by the spiral aortic septum. The aortic pulmonary septum executes a spiral of 180 degrees, and swings into line with the superior margin of the interventricular septum. This process accounts for the manner in which the aortic and pulmonary trunks are entwined in the fully developed heart. Blood from the left ventricle enters the aorta, which passes to the right behind the pulmonary artery. Blood from the right ventricle enters the pulmonary artery, which passes in front of the aorta, turning posteriorly on the left side of the mediastinum. Venous blood from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava flows through the right atrium and into the right ventricle. It's ejected into the pulmonary artery, where a major portion continues through the ductus arteriosus into the descending aorta. Resistance to flow through the collapsed lungs is so great that only a small quantity of blood enters the pulmonary arteries. A correspondingly small amount of blood is returned through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Oxygenated blood from the placenta enters the inferior vena cava, but tends to stream across the right atrium through the foramen ovale and into the left atrium to supplement the scanty pulmonary venous return. This mixture of venous and oxygenated blood enters the left ventricle and is pumped into the aorta, from which the carotid arteries arise to supply the brain. Through the descending aorta, partially oxygenated blood is distributed to the lower portions of the body. This circulatory pattern persists throughout the remainder of fetal development. Within a very few minutes after delivery into the external world, the supply of oxygenated blood from the placenta is interrupted. If the infant is to survive, respiratory exchange in the lungs must be promptly established. As the lungs become inflated, the resistance to pulmonary blood flow is markedly reduced. Constriction of the ductus arteriosus diverts the entire right ventricular output into the pulmonary circulation. Oxygenated blood returning from the lungs is distributed through the systemic circulation. When the pressure in the left atrium exceeds that in the right atrium, the valvula is pressed over the foramen ovale, and partitioning of the heart is functionally complete.